obviously every state's school funding regime relies on a mix of local property tax dollars, state resources, and federal resources, and they're distributed in some manner between the districts that exist in the state. Illinois, as is famously known, and as is, I think, is really problematic, is very reliant on property taxes for its education dollars. That's something you see in your property tax bill, and it's something you see in the inequity in funding between different districts. And for a very long time, it's been the dream of many to solve that problem, to restructure our mechanisms of education funding, ideally in the bargain, restructure our tax code, the way we bring in revenue, how we distribute it, and how we fund schools. That was a dream people had for many years leading up to the 90s, and there was an effort to do it in the 90s, and it's a dream many people have had since. The bill that we're discussing today takes as its starting point the recognition that that's more to bite off at once than can be done, and it attempts to address a single component of this longer program of finding ways to raise adequate revenue to fund all of our schools and to do so in an equitable way. And I think that's really important for context. This bill is not a panacea. It's a piece of a long-term program, and that long-term program has other steps that are crucial, and they're certainly crucial in order to ensure adequacy of revenue to fund our schools. But I think it's also important to have this conversation today because of some changes that have occurred in recent years. What we've seen as the states hit harder and harder fiscal bumps is that we've cut funding for public education in the general state aid formula to the point that we're now prorating that formula at 89%. This would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. Until then, the formula spat out a number, and you could argue with the formula or argue with the inputs or assumptions of the formula, but whatever number it spat out, we would put in the budget and fund. Now we're cutting it by 89% and by 11%, only funding 89% of it. And the effect of that is really pernicious, because what that funding is supposed to do is to counterbalance wealth inequities between districts. And what we've been doing is cutting across the board, which means that the poorest districts have been hit by far the hardest as we've tried to work through the budget challenges in the last 5 years. And that's really, I don't think, what anybody in Illinois would say is the natural way, or the fair way, frankly, to address a fiscal problem. We know that addressing a fiscal problem won't be pleasant, but it shouldn't really intentionally go after the poorest districts first. And so that realization, I think, at least for me, was a transformative moment and told me that we need to do something better. And so out of many people who didn't just have that realization but did a tremendous amount of work led by Senator Manar, but also a number of others, came a long process that Senator Manar will describe that produced Senate Bill 16. Senate Bill 16, as you probably know, passed the Senate, has not yet passed the House, seeks not to restructure our tax code yet, seeks not to change the extent to which we rely on property tax overall, but seeks to say, hey, at least let's take the part of our school funding that comes from the state and rationalize and update that formula. And it's a bill that has a significant impact, obviously, on many districts in the state, certainly including the districts in this region. And it's also, and I know this sounds like a platitude, but it's important to say this is a bill that hasn't passed yet. And it's a bill that I think, if it is going to pass, is going to pass after a lot more input is given and after a lot more changes are made. And a lot of changes, I think, would be made that would take into account concerns of people from across the state. And that's why I'm really, really excited about tonight. I get a lot of email from people about this bill who characterize it as a done deal, and it's really anything but that. And I'm so pleased that we have Senator Manar with us, the lead sponsor of the bill. And I'm so pleased that we have the people in this room who are, frankly, I think in many cases anxious about the impact of the bill, because as I've talked to those people with anxiety, they've all said, hey, we understand the importance of equity, and we understand that people are going to have to give something up perhaps in order to create equity, but we want to make sure this works for us. And as I've talked with Andy about his vision for this bill, he's made it so clear that he's not dogmatic about a specific point or a specific detail. He's only dogmatic about the fact that the formula is broken and needs to be updated. And so I think the kind of discussion that we're positioned to have tonight is a really important piece of making sure that as this big conversation moves forward, it moves forward in a way that's sensitive to the needs of all districts, but also sensitive to the need to do something to address what is very, very clearly, I think, a broken status quo.
This is an important issue, as Daniel articulated, not just to myself, but to so many people across the state, regardless of where you happen to live. I appreciate Senator Biss's help along the way with this issue. There are many members in the Senate who became actively engaged in this discussion when it began during the spring session in 2013, it's actually about a year and a half ago now at this point. And in the Senate, we've embraced the idea that the more people at the table, the better when it comes to this discussion and many others. And we've embraced the idea that together we can come up with a solution that seeks to solve a problem that we've faced for, quite frankly, decades in the state. And that's not an understatement. This has been something that has been brewing for a very, very long time. So, when we began a conversation in the Senate, we began it from that vantage point, that we have to begin to solve this problem, and that the funding formula itself, the law, the school code, the few pages in state law that give the directions on how money is distributed is an important part of that discussion, but it's not the only discussion that we have to have. So, Daniel, I appreciate the invitation to be here this evening. I appreciate the fact that you've made yourself a very big part of this discussion, and I think that's how we get to a solution at the end of the day. So let me rewind the clock, and I think how I'll approach this, because this is a challenge. This is a challenge to approach when I present the bill, because it's a big piece of legislation. It's something that brings about profound change in state law, but I feel it's an appropriate discussion to have, despite the fact that it's a difficult one to have in many instances. But how I tackle this is I want to explain in clear terms where we are today, and talk briefly about the mechanics of Senate Bill 16, and then, of course, talk about where I think the discussion ought to go from this point forward. And this is a continuation of meetings I've been a part of across the state, and I think, to date, I think I've had conversations with well over half of the superintendents in the state. There's 860 some odd superintendents in the state, and I think I'm up to about 410 at this point. But that's what this is about, is to have those discussions, get a perspective from as many people as possible, put as many things into the equation as possible, and I think that's how we're going to end up with as good of a solution as we can come up with. So I think I read this, Daniel. This the series tonight, or the meeting tonight, and the continuation of your series is Opportunities, Challenges, and Striking a Balance when it comes to school funding. I think that's entirely appropriate as to what we're trying to accomplish, not just with Senate Bill 16, but with other things in the mix, especially with the state budget. This began in the Senate in the spring of 2013. We put together a group called the Education Funding Advisory Committee, EFAC is what we call it for short. I'm going to take about 12 months and condense it here in about 35 seconds. We had public hearings across the state. We had 45 or 46 hours of public testimony. The State Board of Education was involved in every step of the way. We developed a website. We put every document that was given to us on the website. It was as transparent as you could imagine. We heard from parents, we heard from teachers, we heard from educators, we heard from administrators, we heard from civic organizations, from organizations that represent statewide groups such as teacher unions or the Principals Alliance, and everyone became involved in a very, very active conversation that grew by every meeting. Every meeting was bigger than the previous one. And in the beginning, and in those, I see some faces in the room that have monitored this for a year and a half. In the beginning, a lot of people dismissed the process as just another process that had been attempted many times over in previous years, and this was no different than those processes. And at the time, there was probably a pretty good chance that those that dismissed what we were embarking on were going to be correct, because if you look at history, And if you look at attempts that have been made to get at the root of this issue over the past 20 years, they haven't come to change anything. So if we use history as a guide, that's a pretty good measure of how difficult this is. And if we use history as a guide, everything would say that we cannot bring about a change in Illinois because we're too diverse of a state. We have too many regional differences, that we have too many differences among school districts or legislators that represent those school districts. And we have all of these hurdles that we have to get over. And that's what people said in the beginning. And that would have been in the fall of 2013 when we started our hearings. And what we sought to focus on, throughout the course of the hearing was simple things that are called facts, and organizing our thoughts around facts and organizing solutions around facts, and taking politics out of the equation, which of course seeps into just about everything we do these days. And we sought those two things to get at the root of the idea that equity makes a difference in the outcomes from public education. Equity at its core. Every expert, every piece of evidence says that equity makes a difference in the output from the public education system, whether it's here in Illinois or in one of the 49 other states. So that was our driver. And so we began to talk about, in very clear terms, what was wrong with our system today, and trying to understand how we got to where we are in Illinois. And that took the advice of people from outside of Illinois, in my opinion. We had to bring in some people that could give us an unbiased, unvarnished view of where we are today as a state. And that wasn't a predetermined list of people. It wasn't a predetermined outcome. But we asked simple questions. How do we do it here compared to not just our peer states, but other states? What has worked in other states? What has failed in other states? And let's try to come up with a list of reasonable things we can change in the school code that would lead us to better equity, greater equity, and thus better outcomes from public schools in the state. So throughout a process, we developed what was called the Illinois School Funding Reform Act of 2014, which is Senate Bill 16, contained in that piece of legislation. And as I said, it's a very large piece of legislation, and I admit that up front, but I think it's appropriate, and it has begun in earnest a very appropriate discussion in all parts of the state. One thing that is very important is that we concentrated in the Senate completely on equity. And equity is very different than adequacy. They're often put into the same thought process in front of the legislature. They're often considered the same thing when it comes to challenges or decisions that have to be made regarding public policy, but they are very, very different. They're equally as important, but they're two very different things. And the best way to explain this is to say that adequacy has to do with the state budget. How much do we as a state devote in the state budget in any given year to public education? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Does it fit into some larger context of what the budget is supposed to represent for the state? But how much do we appropriate in a given year in the state budget for public education? That's adequacy. Equity is very different. And while it relies heavily on adequacy, it doesn't rely exclusively on adequacy. We oftentimes, as legislators, we often go to votes on a budget to measure whether or not we've been successful in terms of how we appropriate money to public schools. You know, we oftentimes say, well, we raise spending for public education, that's a good budget, and or for whatever reason we had to cut, which I'll show you how much we've cut in recent years. So that's a bad budget because we were forced to do it for whatever reason. But Senate Bill 16 proposes a little different viewpoint of those two things. That regardless of how much we have in a given year or how little we have in a given year, how the state distributes that money makes a very big difference when it comes to measuring outcomes from public schools. And that is a very deep conversation. That is a very deep conversation that, frankly, Springfield hasn't had in a very, very long time. And it requires a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of framing of a discussion, and it also brings about many different viewpoints on how to change it, which in my mind is a good thing. But there's a clear difference between adequacy and equity, and Senate Bill 16 at its core attempts to address equity. There was a hearing we held in Springfield, September 17th, 2013, and it was in the Capitol building, and there was a group that knows Illinois well, Ogenblick, Palish, and Associates. We asked them to come and give us kind of their snapshot of how we do things in Illinois. And these are 3 sentences from the summary document. And all these documents are on the State Board of Education's website. But there are 3 sentences that I pull out. And I use this as an example of what a non-biased third-party group of experts look at us in Illinois on how well we do things. And these are 3 very important things. And the first one says, due to the impact of district wealth, this would be EAV, or property wealth in a district, districts that make lower tax effort tend to raise higher amounts of local revenue. So I asked the gentleman who was testifying when he was reading me his bullet points to say that again, because that's contrary to what most people, I think it's okay to say that, would say what we do in Illinois. So there's an inverse relationship between tax rates and per pupil spending. Second thing they said that was a clear indictment of our system is that we conclude that the Illinois school finance system is inequitable for both students and taxpayers. So oftentimes that last word is left off of this sentence when we talk about school funding. We oftentimes gravitate toward the idea that inequity only affects students. And while it has a severe impact on students, it also affects taxpayers in a very real way in the state. And that's getting exponentially worse every year, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then finally, this to me is just a clear indictment of how the legislature has handled school funding in recent years. And I'm not here to blame anybody. I'm just here to say these are the facts that we uncovered and that people said to us in very clear terms. Our concern, this would be the folks that looked at our system, our concern is that the parameters that drive the allocation of state formula support have little meaning beyond assuring that total state aid does not exceed the revenue that the state is willing to provide for school districts. So in clear terms, this just means we appropriate whatever we have in a given year, and we don't attach any priority to it whatsoever. That's a very clear indictment of how we as a state have done this for many, many years. 20 years, almost 20 years, 2 decades. What has that resulted in? This is an extreme example, so I admit that up front. But I use this example to underscore what we are dealing with in a very real way in Illinois. And I want to preface what this chart illustrates with a simple sentence that neither East St. Louis or Arlington Heights are better or worse than each other. This is not about saying one does something better or one does something worse, or that the school board in one makes better decisions than the school board in the other. But this is an accounting of what is reality today in Illinois. So in East St. Louis, with a tax rate of $7.49, they generate $1,200 a student, and they have a low-income percentage, according to the DHS count, which is what ISB uses, of 99%. The proration cut, which Daniel mentioned in his opening remarks, reduces their share of state funds $935 a student today. Arlington Heights, the tax rate is $1.84. Per pupil spending from local funds is $18,400. Their low-income percentage is 26%, and the cut from proration is $58. Now, I've used this example many times over the course of, about a year, I would say. I was in front of Representative Jackson, who represents East St. Louis, at a meeting, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, "Hey, Senator Manar, you don't have it quite right." And I froze for a moment, and I thought, I've been giving some wrong numbers to people. And he said, actually, our tax rate is now $10 to generate the $1,200 per student. So this is an illustration, and again, this is an extreme example of what we face today in the state. But this underscores the challenge that we have. This wasn't the case in 1997 when the current law that is being exercised today was put into place. This was not the case, but inaction over the course of many, many years has making a bad situation even worse. Next slide illustrates what we've cut as a state from public schools. As you can see in 2005, the cut from 2005 up until this past year has been $1.4 billion. That's a decrease of 17%. This, of course, deals with the adequacy side of the equation. No system is going to succeed with this number. We should acknowledge that up front, that you can't starve a system into success. That just is not logical, and it's not going to work. So this is something that we have to address. That obviously deals with the larger context of the state budget. This slide seeks to illustrate how we address the issue of concentrating resources in districts that have high poverty or high numbers of low-income students. If we want the same outcome from two students, one that lives in poverty and one that doesn't, the one that lives in poverty takes a little more money. It takes a little more money to educate that student to get the same outcome. It can be done. It's not a problem that's unsolvable. Every shred of evidence says that if you invest a little more, you'll get the same outcome. But we don't do that today. We don't do that today in Illinois. Matter of fact, we do it worse than every other state in the country, with the exception of one. And it's always a race to see if we have the most regressive or the second most regressive system in the country. And I don't know what the 50th is, by the way. I should find that out. Everybody asks me that. I think it might be Utah, but we're always either 49th or 50th. So we do things contrary to the evidence that says to get the same outcome from a child that lives in poverty compared to a child that doesn't, you have to spend a little more. You have to prioritize your money there, because obviously the savings in the state budget, if you get the same outcome, is exponential over time. So we are in the bottom quartile in terms of not just our peer states, but other states. And we are doing things opposite of what every expert says we ought to be doing. This is an equity issue. This is an issue that's driven not just by the number in the state budget, but how the law or the school code directs money to be spent. And today the law doesn't direct it as experts in that chart illustrates we ought to. There's another group, I mentioned EFAC. There's another group called the Education Funding Advisory Board, which is a board of experts that determine what's adequate for the state. We are well short. We are about $2.5 billion short of where we ought to be for education spending in Illinois today. That exacerbates the problem that we're dealing with when it comes to equity. So we don't put enough money in on the front end. And this is an interesting, I want to step back from the slides and tell you from the perspective of a legislator, and I don't by any means speak for Daniel on this one. I speak for myself, and I got into a little bit of trouble when I said this the first time, but I'm going to keep saying it. I think it's easier to have the discussion about how much money the legislature and the governor in a given year put into schools when we have a formula that we know isn't broken, as opposed to advocating for money to be put into a formula when we know up front it's not going to get to the districts that need it the most. That's what we're faced with today. There was a bizarre, I'll give you a couple of examples that'll just, this will make your head spin around a little bit. There was an exercise that we went through this spring that illustrated what would happen if there was $1 billion cut from P through 12 education. $1 billion. And the idea was to advocate for revenue or spending within the budget framework to prevent cuts from happening. So there was an illustrative model put out, printouts as we all call them, that show that what would happen if we cut $1 billion from public education. And would you believe that there were actually districts that gained money under that scenario? It's not logical, but that's the current formula being exercised under a hypothetical budget framework. That's how upside down we are today. There was another model that showed what would happen if we put extra money. And extra, of course, is in the eye of whoever's speaking it. But if we would just drive extra money into the formula as we have it today, would it get to those on the bottom of this slide? And the answer is no, it wouldn't get there. So that requires a change in state law if we agree that that ought to be a priority. That's one thing that Senate Bill 16 seeks to address. So up front, we have to deal with adequacy. And up front, we have to understand that just driving more money into the current formula isn't going to accomplish what we needed to accomplish to get the results we want. This chart is simply illustrating this idea that we have in Illinois today. Daniel mentioned it in his opening remarks of proration. So we give school districts 89% of the general state aid that they're owed, and that 11% impacts districts disproportionately. And the facts are that districts that have the highest concentrations of poverty, that have the most challenges when it comes to things driving the cost of public education, are the ones that have the biggest burden of proration, because they're the ones that rely heavier on state aid because they don't have local wealth to make up the difference. Think of the East St. Louis chart that was just up on the screen a few minutes ago. So proration is the most detrimental thing that's happening today when it comes to challenges facing equity in Illinois. It actually gets us further away from where we want to go. But think about what that third sentence was on the previous slide from Ogenblick. The point that there's not a lot of thought put into a budget number in the state budget other than does it fit into our larger budget framework for a state. And so when the decision was made to simply prorate everybody at 89% or reduce them by 11% to fit it as a puzzle piece in the state budget, there wasn't a lot of thought put into what is the real impact of that, not just on students, but on taxpayers. That wasn't thought through, and we're in a situation today where we've been prorated for how many years, Nikki? 5 years in a row. Those reductions have had a severe impact on the poorest districts in the state. This is another illustration that shows that when you break up the districts into quintiles, from those with the least amount of resources being generated locally to those with the most amount of resources, that proration disproportionately impacts those that rely heaviest on state aid, and thus the reductions that they've made at the classroom level have been very severe. Okay, on to Senate Bill 16. The promise of Senate Bill 16 isn't to solve every problem we face. I've yet to see a piece of legislation that does that. When I introduced the bill on April the 2nd of 2014, this past session, I stood in the Blue Room of the Capitol and I invited criticism for the bill. I said, this is going to take a lot of eyes on this bill, a lot more than just the eyes of legislators. It's going to take superintendents and parents and school board members being engaged in a discussion. And I said, please offer constructive criticism of the bill, because that's how we get to a better outcome. And I got it. I got it from a lot of people. And that's one reason why I'm here tonight, is to get feedback on the bill and where the bill's hopefully eventually going and how it fits into a bigger conversation about school funding. But the promises of Senate Bill 16 are pretty simple. The details are very large, very vast, but the promises are simple. If you think about, in big terms, if you think about how much we spend on schools from federal, state, and local resources, 25% comes from state government. And less than half of that, 42% of that 25%, is prioritized based on need. So we have about 12% of our total funding for public schools being distributed today based on need. That has resulted in a system that is the least equitable in the country. And because it has gone unchanged for nearly 2 decades, it has been compounded year after year after year. So Senate Bill 16 wipes out the current funding formula and replaces it with a system that recognizes need as the predominant factor for how money is distributed. One of the major changes we made to the bill that came out of our constructive dialogue was phasing it in over several years, over 4 years, capping the losses for districts, getting at the root of true cost drivers for school districts, and coming up with an appropriate formula. Those were all changes that I just made them very broad, but those were all changes that came about during the course of the conversation, not just in front of the legislature, but with organizations and individuals across the state. Total district funding, if you think about that example of the 100%, and then 25% comes from the state, which is problematic because it should be much higher, and then less than half of that 25% comes from, or is geared toward Illinois' neediest students. Despite the fact that we need adequate funding to begin with, how we distribute our money does make a difference, whether there's a lot or there's not a lot in a given year. Within the system today, funds are not getting to where they are most needed, especially with districts with poverty concentrations of over 80%. This is the most profound change in the state, and this isn't a good one, but it's the most profound change in the state from 1997, that the number of students, regardless of how you count them, there's different methods to count at risk or students that are low income or poverty, whatever word you want to use. That number has grown without question. And the concentration, which is another factor, if a district has a high concentration, those districts, the number of those districts have grown as well. So Senate Bill 16 gets to that equation first. How do we prioritize our money for those districts, knowing that that is where we can get a better outcome with increased investment? Senate Bill 16 establishes a base amount of funding for education for every district in the state. It provides additional funding based on students' needs and their interests. I'll explain what interest means in a minute. But we establish a need-based system. You know, can a district come up with resources on their own? What characteristics of the students do they serve? And how does state funding play a role in that equation? That's at the root of Senate Bill 16. And it seeks to strike an appropriate balance between state funds and district funds when it comes to what is necessary to educate children in a particular district. And despite low spending from the state, because remember, we're $2.5 billion short of what EFAB recommends we should be as a state government. So despite this low spending, less than half of state education dollars consider a district's ability to support its schools. That goes back to my example of less than half, which is actually less than half of 25%, is based on what a district needs according to what is outlined by EFAB. But right now we have any number, 20 some odd different buckets of money in the state budget that oftentimes don't correlate well with each other. They were put in the budget for a particular reason, one particular budget year, and they've grown over time. Or they were added to a budget one particular budget year to get a budget passed in Springfield, and they've grown over time. And as we've seen over the years, once you put something in the budget, it's kind of hard to take it out. And so what that's done is that's drawn resources away from what the funding formula exists in existence for in the first place. So we take things like categorical grants, not all of them, but most of them. We take the Chicago Block Grant. We take the separate grant intended for transportation reimbursement, which downstate rural districts rely on heavily. And we put them all into an integrated formula that, again, seeks to measure and address the need of a district and the students that they serve. We develop a weighting system, what we call a weighting system for students that live in poverty, for special education, for students that require transportation, many long distances to schools, for English language learning, and for other student needs. And so the weighting system came from If you go back, I believe it was first introduced to us at our second hearing in Springfield. And it was based on a system that was developed in Massachusetts and other states that's designed to address issues that are cost drivers for public schools on the local level. So this isn't something that I get accused of dreaming this up. I didn't dream this up. This came from experts that have come in and testified to us. The poverty weight for a particular district would be determined based upon a district's concentration of student poverty. This was a change that we made in the bill at the request of many members of the Senate to try to accommodate their points of view. But we seek to address the issue that poverty has grown and that money needs to change to match that growth in poverty in terms of how it's distributed from the state budget to the 860 plus school districts in the state. What I wanted to have for tonight, I didn't have it ready, was to really illustrate how expansive poverty is today compared to 1997 when the current funding formula was put in place. This is a severe difference, and it presents us with a pretty remarkable set of challenges. But regardless of that, other states have addressed this over time, and what we propose in Senate Bill 16 is modeled off of what they have done. I thought a timeline would be helpful. Just to review, in July of 2013 is when the EFAC, Education Funding Advisory Committee was commissioned to meet. We had a series of hearings across the state. All were public. Nobody was denied testimony. Every document that was submitted to us is archived at the State Board of Education's website. And there was a bipartisan group of senators, 8 of us in total, that signed a report that was submitted to the legislature for review. As everyone knows, a report is not a bill, so it took us 2 months to translate that report into an actual piece of legislation. On April the 2nd, Senate Bill 16 was filed, building upon the groundwork that was laid by the testimony that was given to us over the course of the hearings. And in May, I think it was May the 27th, we took a vote in the Senate, and the bill passed, and it's now pending in the House. I don't speak for the House, but by any means, but they've had a series of hearings, or meetings, and when they're not hearings, they've had a series of meetings that have been ongoing, bringing in different groups and individuals to talk about things in the bill that are still being suggested be changed. So let me close just by saying that I guess where I began, this is not a perfect piece of legislation, but I think it does get at the heart of what we've been faced with in the state for a very long time. Is it going to change? It's going to change. There's no doubt about that. Is it going to take some time? It's going to take some time. Is this a open discussion? It's an open discussion. Is every opinion welcome at the table? The answer is yes. It has been, and it will continue to be. This is, in my opinion, the biggest challenge we face in the state today, because there's so much that is affected from success or failure of a public school. There is so much in a community that is affected by a successful or a school district that can't function. And we are faced with a situation today in Illinois where we have well over 70% of our school districts are deficit spending. And while some of those school districts maybe don't make the best financial decisions, the vast majority of them do. And at the root of their problem is not just the issue of equity, which is what Senate Bill 16 seeks to get at, but the issue of adequacy, which is how much do we put into the system in the first place. And it's pretty amazing. You can take a given school district that is on the financial watch list or that has been moved to the financial watch list in the last couple of years, and you can see in very clear terms their deficit. And in many cases, it almost matches exactly what the value of that proration number is to their budget. And there's a very clear connection between both what we as legislators approve in a budget for public education in an appropriation bill and what the law says and how the law directs that money to be distributed. There's a very, very clear connection between those two things and what happens at the local level with a school board and a superintendent in a school district. So given that, I'm not insensitive to the effect of this bill on school districts. We oftentimes look at things as winners and losers, and that's something we have to do. But I would say this tonight, that one reason, maybe the only reason, that the formula exists today in its current state is because there's been an unwillingness to change it on the part of the legislature. So while I use current funding levels for districts as a good place to begin a conversation, I don't view them as legitimate. I don't. Because no one that sat before our committee said that the way we distribute money today is the way we ought to do it. But that doesn't discount the fact that this bill has very real impacts on school districts. But it's my hope moving forward that this discussion will bring about the adequacy discussion that is desperately needed in the state. And I think those two things together, is where we will begin to solve this problem for the first time in about 20 years.
I'm going to give you a bit of a story of where we are here in District 65, Evanston, Skokie, and where we are in budget planning just in general, and then what the ramification of not only Senate Bill 16 might be, but other tweaks to the finances that go on in a public school system like our own. So I'll make some broad comments. I'll tell you a little bit about the impact on Evanston and Skokie, and then I'll suggest a couple ways to think about moving forward, a couple ways to tweak and turn, and then hopefully open it up for broad debate. So yes, the finance system in Illinois is broken, and that's something that needs to be fixed, and I think we can recognize that. And yet Illinois, and you mentioned this, Senator, in your comments, needs to really maintain focus on children with great needs and the greatest needs. And how do we actually do that? And indeed, how do we do that in a place like Evanston and Skokie? But how do we do that across the state? And my recommendation, which is embedded in your presentation, is really to focus on children and their needs, and to be careful about focusing on districts as we move forward, just because I'm worried about the kids that I serve, and I'm worried about the families I serve, and the ramifications. Let me set the context. And in the district that you're sitting in, we have about 7,500 students. We have 40% of our students whose families are at or below the poverty line. We have 5% of our students who are homeless, in homeless situations. 12% of our students have special needs, and 10% of our students are English language learners. And indeed, these are parts of in the fine print, the formula, and how to actually make the adjustments there. So we serve a substantial number of students who have high needs, who come from high poverty background, and a substantial proportion or percentage of students that have these needs. And indeed, we serve a percentage and a number of students that far exceeds many like districts, and if I may, and with all respect, many like districts in the northern part of Cook County that are also struggling with where do we go on school finance. My read of the legislation from what I know is also a shift in some ways from northern Cook and where wealth is concentrated to other places in the state. And indeed, that may make sense, and yet it causes worries in my office upstairs and with my board here and the board of the high school. Because we'll continue to serve a substantial number of high poverty kids, high need kids, no less of a loss than those of our neighboring districts who are also serving. And the no less of a loss means that the percentage hit, if I may, or in the winners or losers. And I don't, in the world of equity, I don't love that, because we are all citizens of Illinois and we are all citizens of the villages and towns that we serve. But I'm concerned that the formula, as it plays itself out, will have a substantial and significant effect on a place like Evanston, and you've probably heard this in other places, but Evanston and Skokie are geared to take a substantial hit, if I may. So again, 7,500 students. We have about $110 million budget. We have 40% of our students in poverty and a wide range of kids who have special needs. There are other things that impact our own internal budget presentation separate from SB 16. With pension reform and with really the burden of the pension shifting and what we believe will be shifting from the state to the local governmental authority, i.e. us, the district. With lingering questions on the income tax, which we all face as citizens, but which is going on. And with the way that we set our budget, which is based on the Consumer Price Index, which we see going down and down and down, and so that our projections go down and down and down. If we look at our own internal budgeting, before SB 16 kicks in, and even if we factor in a wee bit of the pension reform, or a lot of the pension reform, in 2016-17, we're projecting today a $3.4 million deficit here. Now, this is an internal problem and challenge and opportunity that we have to take on and think about how we spend our resources and how we move forward. But 2016, we have a $3.4 million projected deficit. In 2017-18, a $4.7 million deficit. And then 2018-19, a $7 million deficit. So those are managerial issues, programmatic issues that we're facing here. Projections today, based on best analyses from people that we all work with on SB 16, in a place like Evanston and Skokie, based on who we are, what our tax rates are, and who the children we serve, is probably a $6.5 to $7 million hit because of SB 16. So, given the uncertainties that I have facing our district over the 3 out years after the next fiscal year and SB 16, that's potentially a $10 million cut. Even without the uncertainties, it's a potential $7 million reduction. And even with, and I appreciate this, the grandfathering in of the redistribution, in the first year it would be a $1.7 million, $1.75 million cut, and approximately a $3.5 million cut the following year as we graduate in. So the concern I have, and I'm sure you've heard this, and so this is not a surprise, is that for the children and the families we serve, almost regardless of our financial issues that we have internally, we will face a substantial decrease in the resources that we receive from the state to serve children with the highest needs. And we would have to determine what services we would take away, what we would cut, and or go to our citizens for raising of taxes, and that's also a dilemma because that goes forward. In a high-taxed district, we're highly taxed, and so that's a hard thing to sometimes respond to. So possible solutions. First of all, the fact that both senators are here and are open and are engaging all of us is extremely important. So I honor you and I thank you, and I know that we'll continue this dialogue, and I know that on behalf of my board and the board members here from various districts, the opportunity to actually put voice out is really very important. So thank you for that. If we think about it, the weighting system, as you provided, is something that I think the technical term needs to be tweaked. And again, some of these are where the thresholds are, where the cutoffs are, and indeed, I haven't done the deep analysis of if I did it in a self-serving way, where the right place would be to tweak it so I would be one side or the other so that we could actually do well. I do want to say that as a sidebar, I'm a little bit familiar with Massachusetts legislation, which is a seminal legislation to equalize funding. But they were fully funded at the time when they did it. So when Massachusetts actually did this work, they weren't at 89% prorated, they were at 100%. And so that actually, as Daniel suggested earlier, and as Andy did too, the proration actually causes us to have some issues as well. So figuring out and really rolling up our sleeves on the weighting system makes sense. And indeed, it's embedded in your presentation and in mine, following the needs of the children and how we actually pay attention to the 40% of the kids who are at or below poverty level in my district and making sure that I can actually serve them when the day is done. There's a per pupil loss cap that's embedded in this at $1,000 per pupil. And if I may, I would love to have that reduced. Now, again, that changes all sorts of calculations as we move forward. But at the $1,000, and that may be the part of the threshold piece for a district like Evanston that causes us to face the potential of a $6.5 or $7 million cut. So I really want to stop there and open up for a conversation. Yes, the funding system is broken, and we struggle with that. But yes, we still serve the children and the families who live in our city and in both of our cities. And many of our families, all of our families, move to Evanston because they embrace the schools. They move to Skokie because they want to embrace the schools. And especially families who have very deep needs and are coping with poverty, they move across Howard Street for a great purpose, and it's to come to this great district. And my worry is, as we work to protect the general welfare of all students in the state, that we're going to not be able to protect the general welfare of the students that we serve here in the elementary district and at the high school. So it's not a perfect world. We know that we're not fully funded. We know that there's lots of idiosyncrasies that have to be worked out. But I have to really push hard to make sure that as we go down this course, that we don't have a detrimental effect on the families and the children that I serve.
There's an obvious phenomenon happening in the room, right? It's difficult and painful to conceive of an effort to massively enhance equity while simultaneously exposing a district, almost half of whose students are living in poverty, to a potential $10 million deficit. That's the pressure placed on the entire system by the enormous deficit, the inadequacy of the funding. And that's a problem that will be expressed in one way or another, but always in a detrimental way if we don't tackle the adequacy problem. I want to bring this way further down to the ground before we go to questions and just offer, for very brief response from either or both of you, a variety of kind of a menu of thoughts that have occurred to me over the weeks and months and trying to figure out ways to do this that would be less abrupt and challenging for a variety of districts that are experiencing challenges. One that was discussed at length in Springfield and discarded, I think for a pretty clear reason, was the notion of finding some mechanism to decrease the cost that districts experience in delivering educational services by somehow relieving districts from some state mandates. Is there a way to do that in a way that could provide meaningful relief? Second of all, is there a way to transform the phase-in period that could be somehow more sensitive? Is there a way to tweak some of the parameters, as Paul mentioned? Specifically, is there a way to change the way in which poverty density is an input into this formula that could alleviate some of the challenges we're experiencing? Is there a way to alter the formula so that local costs of living are taken into account? Because, of course, cost of living is an important input into teacher salary. And finally, Paul mentioned something very interesting and important, and that was quite different than some statistics that Andy put up on the screen regarding local effort. So Paul describes accurately this as a district that is expending a lot of effort in its property taxation and doesn't want to be punished for doing so. And Andy points out that there are inequities across the state where districts that are exhibiting far more effort locally, far more effort, are helped less by the state. Is there a way to somehow incorporate local effort more directly into the formula so that we're not putting in place a perverse set of incentives and encouraging districts to decrease their own taxation, expecting that difference to be made up by the state? So I list those options simply because they're natural things to discuss, and I want to see if either of you have quick responses to some or all of them.
Amendment 4 was an attempt to begin to define what is mandate relief. This is a very broad topic. It was brought up during the course of, I believe, each of our hearings during that phase of this process. It was challenging to define that in terms of a piece of legislation, and that Amendment 4 on Senate Bill 16 ultimately was not adopted onto the bill. It was not part of the final bill that was passed in the Senate, but that continues to be part of the discussion, as it ought to be. Second thing you mentioned, Daniel, was tweaking of the phase-in period. I would simply say yes. I think this is a place where there's broad agreement that, by the way, the tweaking of the phasing in is for every district. So even districts that gain money under the bill, there's a phase-in for them as well, which is markedly different from years past when the legislature created these things called hold harmless provisions that would hold the district harmless to any given year's change in the general state aid calculation, despite whether or not it was warranted. So what we sought to do, and it made it budget neutral, was those that gained money, the money would be phased in, and those that lost, that would be phased in as well. But I think simply saying yes, the answer is yes to that. That's something that I think everyone agrees with. Poverty density, the answer is yes. There's different ways to measure poverty. There's different ways to assess the impact of poverty in any given district. There was actually an individual from Evanston, I was at a meeting several months ago, who said, maybe we should look at this at a building level framework, and that's probably not a bad idea. And that didn't come out in our hearings, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it. Cost of living, Daniel mentioned this idea. This was an idea that we'd explored during the final few hearings that we conducted, and it just wasn't developed enough to put it into the bill. I particularly think it's a good idea because we should just recognize up front that it costs more to hire a teacher in some parts of the state than the other. And that's a big cost driver in terms of the budget of a particular school district. And there's other states that do this and do it successfully. So I think that can be looked at, and we're looking at that now. And then the last thing, which is, I think, how do you define what is a local effort? Right now, we assume a tax rate. We use tax rates. There were a few broad proposals that were brought in front of the committee to for example, use the value of property per pupil as an alternative, or a median EAV over a number of years. There's different ways to do this, but in Senate Bill 16, we don't make any change to that particular piece as compared to what's in law today. But I guess in total, I think all of these things have been, to some degree, some more than others, and ought to be part of the conversation moving forward.
Let me add one more to the list, which is, and maybe this is not possible, but as the state moves into some level of pension reform, where the state will have some savings, and the state needs to have some savings there, can some of those savings be devoted to the funding of children and families who live in poverty, who need the extra services to do well? And then a final thing, and this is not what you asked, but the question I have as well as a citizen of Illinois is, if this happens, when this happens, and resources are redistributed, what happens when a large amount of money lands at a school district? And again, what are the parameters that will be stated? And I know if you look at some of the equity redistribution in California, which is monumental in many ways, districts are ending up with a lot of resources, and it's not quite clear what they're going to do with them on day one. And so, and then there's the whole, is the state going to be a regulatory agency? Or the state is a regulatory agency, but how will the state regulate that, and what does that really mean? I do worry about what happens when, and I think that's another issue of implementation,
Absolutely.
Which I hope you're paying attention to.
Even if the budget is static, the general state aid calculation happens once a year, and there are winners and losers every year, every single year. This is not a static situation despite the challenges we face. And so every year, some districts get more and some districts get less. That's just how things work, even with the formula that we have today. But that, I think, to the point you made, that's one reason why we would phase in districts that gain money as well, because there should be proper planning with that.
That I made it to a meeting of the Education Funding Advisory Committee that took place in Waterloo, which is very far. And this was one topic of discussion. There's a lot of concern of exactly this point, that counting students below a particular threshold is a really, really coarse measure. And is there a better way to count poverty properly? Not just density like we currently do in the sense of percent of kids who are under that threshold, but also how do you really properly weight different levels of poverty?
He brought this point up in Waterloo. He made this point in Waterloo. And that was our final hearing. And that discussion resulted in the language in the bill that says that there should be a determination by the State Board of Education on what is the appropriate way to measure poverty or at risk. You know, poverty actually doesn't appear anywhere in the statute. It's at risk. And I think the point that came out of that hearing, and again, Daniel made this point, was, are we doing it the right way? Are we using the right tool to get the truest assessment that we can find? And most people, most educators in the state would say, no, we're not. But that means we have to replace it with something. So if we look at other states, you know, there's different ways to do this. And maybe an assessment tool 1 year, because technology changes, you know, we have better ways to assess things all the time. You know, there was a time in the state when we used a snapshot of a census to assess poverty, and at some points in time that data was 9 years old because we were still using it 9 years later until the next year when the census came around. So we've gotten rid of that, and we've moved to you know, what we call a DHS count. But most people, I think, would say that there's a better way to do it. And so that's why in the bill, it's an open question, but I would say in that case, we should leave it to educators to figure it out, not legislators. And, you know, to your point, I think there is a better way to do it, and I think we can look to other states to see how they do it. Fred, I think you're right about the cupcake. But I would just contend we're dividing up a cupcake now, just a different way. The cake isn't any bigger today than it is under Senate Bill 16. We're still dividing up a cupcake under the current funding formula. And I do believe it's a difficult proposition to say, what do we do first, knowing that it's very difficult to do both at the same time. It's difficult to advocate for more money in a very strained state budget, number one. Number two, it's difficult to advocate for more money in a strained budget to be put into a funding formula that wouldn't result in money getting to the districts that we've been talking about tonight. I think it's an easier proposition, even under a difficult budget formula, to say, let's get the mechanics of the law correct, and then we can have the debate about how much do we put in. Because right now what's holding that debate up, which is really what we need to be having, is the fact that we have a funding formula that very few people think is working well in the state. So it is, you make a valid point, but the cake or the cupcake isn't any bigger or smaller under this formula versus the formula as proposed in Senate Bill 16.
And yet the reality, which is the case, is that if we were cutting back $7 million of services, we'd have to put everything on the table and see how we could actually operate in a fiscally prudent way to move forward, and that will have an impact on students, and that will have an impact on students who have special needs.
And as far as the special needs student organizations, my door is open. My door is open, and it has been since day one. And there were many opportunities to give public testimony. There were committee hearings in the Capitol building during the months of April and May. All of those things are a continuation of the process that we're having here tonight, and I would just reinforce that again, that not just myself, but others that have been working on the legislation have an open door, and we're willing to sit down and talk through any issue that they bring forward.
The honest answer is I don't know, because we have to see what plays out. I think the other way to answer the question is that we have to be responsible for the transparent expenditure of our resources, and so we've got to be able to both be planful in what we're trying to do and what we're trying to attempt and what outcomes we want to get to. We want to raise student achievement. We want to close achievement gaps that we have that are quite evident here in Evanston and Skokie. And so the ability to be able to focus on those expenditures and then to compare them either across our own schools or across districts is something that appeals to me. And if there are examples across the state where where schools or districts are spending resources and getting outstanding outcomes, I want to learn from that as well, so that we could, because our focus is on student achievement, full stop. Our focus is on eliminating the achievement gaps that we have, full stop. And so how do we actually do that? How do we do that better? And how do we learn? That would be helpful for us.
The school code in Illinois reflects the fact that we have an awful lot of school districts, which means we have an awful lot of small school districts, which are likelier to be kind of homogeneous than a really big school district would be. But the fact remains that we have plenty of districts that aren't homogeneous, and we have one giant district and plenty of medium districts. And I think that there's real benefit in understanding the school level finances rather than just the district level finances, not just for that one giant district, but also for these medium-sized districts like the one that we're in now, and there are a number of others of which exist predominantly in suburban areas.
This also gets at the issue that Paul brought up to advocate for looking at an individual school building, perhaps when it comes to assessing need rather than a district as a whole. So it gets at the same issue that within a district you might have a particular challenge or circumstance that is equally as challenging for another district in its entirety. Senate Bill 16 doesn't address that today, but Senate Bill 16 does say that school districts have to be transparent with their spending at the building level, which is not required today. Many districts do it already, most don't, but I generally, like Daniel, agree that more transparency when it comes to government spending is better.
Point one, maybe this is good, maybe this is bad, I don't know, but the bill doesn't take as an input the current fiscal position of the district. So it doesn't reward or punish you for having a deficit or a surplus. That's a reality that districts are experiencing one way or the other, but it's not an input into the current law or the formula. The second thing I would say is that, yes, it's certainly true that in general the higher property wealth districts are likely to wind up with less money under Senate Bill 16 as it currently exists than they currently receive. That said, actually, to be quite honest, districts like Evanston and others that have comparatively high property wealth but also higher levels of, for instance, poverty, could conceivably stand to lose more under Senate Bill 16 as it's currently configured, simply because they're currently receiving more. So it's not nearly so simple as to say that a New Trier would lose more than an Evanston. My recollection is they lose less per kid than Evanston, and quite significantly, actually.
I think that's right.
I think that's right. That is.
And to be just totally direct, as I saw some heads nodding, that has a lot to do with why some people are concerned about this bill.
The bill doesn't make an assessment of the financial condition of a district moving forward, but neither does current law. So we do have a situation where many districts that gain money every year under even a static budget or even a budget that's reduced have healthy balances. So there are many districts in the state that have healthy balances that gain money every year in the state funding formula today. And that, I don't want to overgeneralize, but that is reality for a good number of school districts today. So we don't, as a matter of the functioning formula today, assess a district's financial status in terms of how money is divided among the 860 some odd school districts in the state, but neither does Senate Bill 16. Senate Bill 16 doesn't do that. There were proposals to do that. There were proposals that were brought in concept that said that one measure ought to be what is a balance of a particular district's budget. How healthy or how unhealthy is their budget? That gets problematic for any number of reasons, and ultimately we heard those proposals. We didn't incorporate them into the bill.
Paul referred to pension reform as a threat, potentially more than an opportunity, at least as relates to a potential cost shift to the local districts. Yeah, I completely agree. We have, outside of the scope of tonight, but we have a tax rate dropping from 5 to 3.75% on January 1st. That's not a sustainable situation for the state of Illinois at all. So we have to do something else, something better. And I have always hoped and tried to encourage us to use that cliff as an opportunity to have a smart, fair conversation about how to reform our tax code. I look forward to working with you on that because the concept of shared sacrifice requires sacrifice that's really broadly shared across the population.
Both very good points. I would agree with you on the first point. I don't want that either. But from the viewpoint of many, the course that we're headed on in the state is not getting everybody to mediocrity. That's not the course we're on today. The course we're on today is having a few that succeed incredibly well and a whole bunch that don't succeed at all. And most of the problems that are faced by that very large group of school districts begin with a flawed funding formula. So neither one of those two things is good. We're living with one today, and I would share your concern that we don't want to have a state that has mediocre schools because of a piece of legislation that was passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor and enacted into law. So that's not what we're trying to get at. Number two, we had significant discussion about this in front of our committee hearings, and linking assessing tools, which are a very different conversation. Many of those things have been put into place in recent years, more so than they were in years past through Senate Bill 7, which was a piece of legislation that passed the General Assembly before I was a member. But linking assessing tools to money and to outcomes was something that we had talked about. But there's nothing specific in the bill that would either reward or I guess, I hate to use the word punish, but would reward or punish a district for not meeting particular goals financially. But I do think it's important to make sure that if these things are data-driven and the policy changes that are being articulated in the bill are being put together based on data that experts told us are facts, then we want to make sure that that is the outcome that we're trying to get to.
At the heart of I think what Andy, you're arguing and what we would argue is, again, around student performance. It's around having all kids achieve at the highest levels, having all of us be proud of the students that come out of Illinois, all of us be proud of the students that come out of Evanston and Skokie. And so then what are the best practices? What are the needs that teachers, social workers, special educators need to be able to meet the needs of the children in the districts, and how do we actually resource that? So I like your suggestion. How do we learn from anything that goes on, whether it's redistributing resources as we know it, whether it's at some point, as Daniel, as you put on the table, thinking about taxation and tax code and income tax and actually raising revenues that then could be used to support the best practices to make a difference in the lives of kids.
Let me try to tackle all those things. I didn't propose mandate relief as a part of the bill because I didn't think anything other than it should be part of the conversation. It was not part of what we initially set out to do. And mandate relief is very difficult. It's very difficult to define when you put the language of a bill together, and it's very difficult to find allies in the legislature after you do put a bill together to be standing with you to relieve school districts of mandates. That is incredibly difficult. I don't know of too many mandate relief bills that have been introduced. I'm the sponsor of an amendment to one, and believe me, my phone was going off the hook for some of the things that people brought to me saying, let's give us some reasonable relief as a school board, for example. So I think moving forward, we ought to have a thoughtful conversation about what mandate relief should be and shouldn't be. I gave it a crack, and it didn't work because there wasn't even close to a majority of members in the Senate that would approve that amendment. You mentioned home values in Bunker Hill. I'll invite you there, Bill. I'll invite you there, and you can count how many homes are worth more than $250,000.
I went on 3, so very
Yeah.
small sample size. But the thing is, to compare apples to apples. I mean, I could have gone and looked at $100,000 homes and $100,000 properties
Yeah,
in my community too. I was trying to make sure that we were comparing apples to apples.
sure. We too are subject to tax cap. So think of it from the perspective of a district that is subject to a tax cap, that has poverty that's increasing exponentially every year, that get cut in the state aid formula double digits every year. What do they do? What do they do? I'll tell you what they do. They don't have an art program. You have kids that will go through their entire public school life without ever having taken art. Now, if that's okay in Illinois, then stand up and say so. I don't think anybody thinks that's okay. But that's the type of thing that's playing itself out in districts across the state. And that's a reality in a lot of schools. You know, there's schools that you know, I went to a school the other day in Livingston, and I could see through the wall, and there's a kindergarten class in that building. And that's not because that school board makes bad choices. It's because they're subject to a tax cap law. They have growing poverty, which means that the students bring in all kinds of issues with them, not their fault, but they walk into the classroom with all kinds of issues. And there's a state aid formula that doesn't recognize the needs of that district in any given fiscal year. And every year when the current formula recalculates itself, it's another reduction on top of proration. And there is no relief for that school district because there's a tax cap law. Could go to the voters. They've attempted, and we all know how that goes most often. So you articulated very well the challenges that we face. I mean, those are big challenges we face. And I think, you know, again, the bill's designed to have these conversations that, quite frankly, we haven't had in almost 2 decades in the state. And we should talk about these things.
We have a lot of work to do in this state for a number of reasons to make the education profession as welcoming and attractive as we want it to be. Part of that's rhetoric and newspapers and politics, and part of that's the policy implications of scarcity. But it's a real problem. And I know that there's a lot of people in this room who are like, yeah, of course, why is he even saying this out loud? But I know there are also some people in this room who are skeptical of this, because I hear from you. Go visit a school. Go to a school and just talk to teachers. How do you feel about the profession right now? Do it. If you're skeptical about this, go do it. You will learn a lot. Our next event in this series, just ratcheting our way up that age ladder, will be on higher education and college affordability and funding. That'll be October 27th at 7 p.m. at Northwestern. Details at senatorbiss.com, where we will put up Andy's slides and hopefully as much video as we can. I do want to say 3 quick things of substance. Number one, I really hope it was very clear during this discussion. I know I've said this a lot of times. I know it sounds like I'm haranguing you. I know Andy is too. Here we go again. This is a work in progress, and it's a work in progress that cannot get across the finish line without a significant amount of continued input. I think, I'll just say it, I think there's some anxiety that this is all a show, that the fix is in behind the scenes and there's public hearings just so it can later be said that there are public hearings. I think the exact opposite is the truth. I think this bill is dead without significant public input and without the incorporation of a lot of these ideas. We had, I think today, a lot of really useful discussions. I just beg of everyone here who cares about one aspect or another of this topic to stay in touch with me, to stay in touch with Andy, and to work through these challenges because of the importance of this issue. Number 2, thank you for making this conversation happen. This is really, really a great thing for a community that there's this many people who are willing to sit for this many hours on an issue of this technical complexity and this incredible valence and be so thoughtful and contribute so much. It really means more than I can say to you about my ability to serve you in the legislature. So really, thank you, thank you, thank you, not just for being here, but for how thoughtful and how constructive you've made this discussion. And finally, speaking of thoughtful and constructive, I just think we are really lucky to have two great public servants, not only here tonight, but serving us every day. I say, again, I feel very lucky to be a District 65 parent now and for quite a few more years. And it's just such a joy to serve with you, Andy. So I'd like us all to close by joining me in for what is not just an important discussion tonight, but really a significant devotion to real public service. Thank both of our guests and hope we can continue the discussion. Thanks.